All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Selena Gervais, and I'm a research scientist here at the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. And we're going to be talking today about social and environmental justice in the context of the core CM projects, the carbon ore, rare earth, and critical mineral projects, and the communities in Wyoming that those are affecting. I'm going to give a little brief overview, and then our panelists, I'm going to give an opportunity for our panelists to talk. I do just want to say that we have had some internet issues in buildings next door, so I apologize if there ends up being any interruption here, but we'll get that fixed as quickly as possible, and thankfully we haven't had any issues so far yet. So go ahead and advance to the next slide there. Thank you, Christine. So I just want to give a little introduction to the CoreCM projects themselves. They are DOE-sponsored projects, and the focus of them is exploring the potential for recovering rare earth elements and critical minerals from carbon ore, from coal and coal byproducts. So most of you are probably familiar with rare earth elements and critical minerals. There are probably some common ones that you've heard about, things like lithium and cobalt, things that are important in the manufacturing of low carbon energy materials, technologies, electronics. So they really have implications for national security and energy independence that are important industries to be developing the supply chain here in the United States. And the other part of this project is that there's really a focus on developing these industries as a way to promote economic growth and workforce development in these communities. Go ahead to the next slide, Christine. So the two projects that we have here in Wyoming, one is in the Powder River Basin, and the other is in the Wind River Basin and the Greater Green River Basin. So those are the communities that we're focusing on. And as you can see, the Powder River Basin extends up into Montana, and the Green River Basin extends down into Colorado. So those, of course, are communities where there has been historical coal production and energy industries. So we'll be talking about some of the specific social and environmental justice concerns and issues in these communities. Go ahead, Christine. So I just want to give kind of a very brief overview of social and environmental justice so that we have a better understanding altogether of what we're going to be talking about here today. So social justice really hinges on the distribution of advantages and disadvantages across people in society, all members of society. So that includes people from all races, ethnicities, colors, backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses. And environmental justice is a part of social justice. It's a component of it. And it's the part that really focuses on the distribution of those advantages and disadvantages of environmental factors. So things that might affect like the health and safety of where we live, work, recreate, things related to water quality, air quality, things that really affect our physical environment. And I also want to highlight this EPA definition of environmental justice, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So I think this highlights kind of two important components of environmental justice, and one is that meaningful involvement piece. So it is really focused on public participation, and that everyone has agency and a chance to be involved in decision making. As well as the non-discrimination piece, that regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, regardless of background, it's inclusive that all people are involved in that decision-making process. Go ahead, Christine. So, that gives us kind of a basic understanding, but my hope is that in this discussion today, we really expand that understanding and start to talk more in depth about what it means in the context of these core CM projects and these communities. So expanding on the definition of social and environmental justice, as well as why they're important in the context of these core CM projects, what the perspectives of core CM communities are, the federal perspective, the indigenous perspective, and talking about some of these legal and policy issues related to environmental justice and these core CM communities. So I'm going to leave it there. For the rest of this first hour, we're going to have our 5 panelists present. They'll give some background information, a deeper understanding of some of the issues related to social and environmental justice that they work on. And then we'll be doing our question and answer after all of them present. So you can put questions in the Q&A box there as we go, but then we won't be answering any of those questions until we have each of our panelists discuss a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first panelist, Matt Henry, and he's an assistant professor at the Honors College here at University of Wyoming, and he's going to be talking about some of the social, cultural, and environmental justice considerations. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Selena. Really want to thank the organizers of this event, first of all, Christine and Devon, as well as you, Selena, for moderating this discussion on this really important topic today. As Selena said, my name is Dr. Matt Henry, and I'm an assistant professor in the Honors College and an affiliate with the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. And my work focuses primarily on environmental justice and the human dimensions of energy, water, and climate issues, specifically in the context of just transition policies and processes. And this morning, I'm just going to give a high-level overview of environmental justice, a little bit of history, talk about the ways social and environmental justice interact, and then some key considerations for core CM. So if you could turn it over to the next slide, please. Great. So one really basic definition I like to think of when I'm talking about environmental justice is the right of all people to share equally in the benefits bestowed by a healthy environment. It's a nice tight definition of environmental justice. You can go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And just to repeat what Selena noted here, the EPA definition is a little bit more capacious than that. And I just underlined some key aspects here and I'll just read it again. The EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And then the EPA goes on to say this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys, 1, the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and 2, the equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a little bit of brief history of environmental justice, and I think this context is really helpful for working up to how we might think about EJ and core CM together. A lot of scholars and activists date environmental justice back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Specifically, environmental justice suits or claims are often brought under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits the discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program or activity that receives federal funds or financial assistance. And we might also see the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is also often under which environmental justice claims are brought. And so we can really date environmental justice back to the 60s and the 70s as a sort of parallel but a divergent way of thinking about environmentalism, away from the woods and waters focus of a lot of big environmental groups that tend to focus on protecting charismatic species and scenic landscapes and so forth. And so a few seminal moments in the sort of emergence of environmental justice, the Warren County, North Carolina incident in 1982, in which a small, predominantly African-American community was designated to host a hazardous waste landfill that was going to be supposed to accept PCB contaminated soil that resulted from illegal dumping along highways. And the folks in this community protested with the support of the NAACP and a number of other organizations. And ultimately didn't stop the siting of this facility, but did put environmental justice on the national map as part of the national discourse around environmental issues. Fast forward 5 years later, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States was published by the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice. And this is viewed as a sort of seminal report showing the correlation between toxic waste dump siting, industrial facility siting, next to communities of color and low-income communities. In 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held, and what came of that were the 17 principles of environmental justice, which are often sort of adhered to or viewed as guidance for environmental justice organizations, grassroots organizations, and so forth. And examples of these principles include, for example, environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. So certainly 17 principles of environmental justice are sort of seminal to the history of the movement. Can you move to the next slide, please? So environmental justice today is much expanded beyond the issue of toxic waste dump siting or industrial facility siting next to communities of color. It has a much more sort of capacious usage in the discourse, so to speak. Next slide, please. We can consider environmental justice issues under a number of subcategories. For example, affordable and resilient housing, gentrification, disaster resilience, under the built environment, food insecurity and access, climate impacts on agriculture, food systems, energy and energy justice, which I'll talk about in a moment, tends to touch on issues such as extraction and power plant siting, energy poverty and access, land reclamation and stranded assets, and of course, energy transition, which is on the minds of everyone here in the Western US right now. And then climate change, the disproportionate impacts of low income and minority communities. We might also call this climate justice discourse. And then some adjacent environmental justice concerns as well, like jobs, labor rights, I'd already said affordable and resilient housing, healthcare, and reproductive rights. So environmental justice today has grown and included more and more issues underneath its sort of big tent. Next slide, please. A couple notes here regarding enforcement of environmental justice. It should be noted there's no sort of federal law governing environmental justice at the moment. The EPA doesn't really have authority to mandate actions or remedies, and often environmental justice issues emerge with regards to or from pressure from below, from grassroots action, from groups of people making claims, suing, taking issues to court. There are some mechanisms that are adjacent to or do provide relief in terms of environmental justice. We could look, for example, at federal Superfund law that started in the 1980s. President Clinton's Executive Order 12898 issued in 1998 did require agencies to make achieving environmental justice part of their missions, and empowered the Environmental Justice Advisory Council to influence the EPA, but it's gone largely enforced. It's mostly up to the agencies to incorporate or prioritize environmental justice into their missions. And that since 1998 has taken a long time for some agencies to really prioritize environmental justice. More recently, the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative has prioritized putting 40% of investments in climate and clean energy to disadvantaged communities. So that's one recent way of enforcing or prioritizing EJ at the federal level. But environmental justice communities, by and large, we might consider often in a defensive posture, under-resourced, seeking remedies and needing to take a sort of bottom-up approach to make claims that they're facing injustice and need remedies. Next slide, please. So there are a few different basic frameworks for environmental justice. There are more than this, but these are the sort of basic way we can think about environmental justice. On the one hand, the concept of distributive justice is the prioritization of equal distribution of impacts and burdens on communities. So impacts might be with regards to the extraction of natural resources, the the idea that revenue should be equally distributed to communities that are adjacent to extractive sites, for example, or dependent on an extractive economy. And burdens, of course, refer to externalities, environmental impacts, and so forth. Procedural or process justice is the idea that decision making should be inclusive, transparent, and fair. Recognition justice is the idea that diverse peoples and cultures and their knowledge systems and relations to the environment or to the land are recognized and respected. And then reparative justice is the idea that the repair of human and biotic relationships should take place if they are indeed damaged by injustice. And you can see here in this Venn diagram, there's a good bit of overlap and intersection between or amongst these categories or these frameworks of environmental justice. Next slide, please. So we can also, within the context of CORSIEM and think about energy justice as a subcategory of environmental justice. And of course, you can see how we can tailor different subcategories of environmental justice to fit these frameworks here. Next slide, please. So with regard to energy justice or injustice, there are a lot of considerations, access, energy poverty, and so forth. But when it comes especially to a place like Wyoming or other states that are sort of major producers of raw materials, minerals, and mineral wealth, and so forth, a lot of injustices we can find upstream in the supply chain, specifically around extractive processes and so forth. So this is a nice little diagram or spectrum to consider potential injustices at various stages of extraction and materials processing, combustion, and so forth. But we can really think about CORSIEM in this category as well as the sort of upstream impacts of CORSIEM on communities, local ecosystems, and so forth. Next slide, please. So with regard to mining, especially, this would be the upstream portion of the sort of energy supply chain. It should be noted roughly about 3% of the country's oil and natural gas reserves, 15% of the coal reserves, and a huge portion of uranium reserves are located on indigenous lands in the United States. And this often has resulted in a pretty sort of dismal track record of dispossession, erasure, violence against indigenous peoples in various ways. And on the other hand, the US imports more than 90% of elements critical to advanced energy generation, which brings into additional justice and ethical concerns, specifically with regard to justice. A lot of child labor, a lot of slave labor, a lot of human rights violations in the critical mineral and supply chain. And this has increasingly been documented, which is one of the reasons that we've seen a little bit of a recent push to onshore the production of critical minerals and rare earth elements, is one to remove dependence on foreign or foreign produced materials, but also there are significant ethical considerations in the supply chain as well. Next slide, please. So there's a little bit of a paradox here when it comes to CORSIEM and justice. So on the one hand, these materials are really critical to decarbonization and a transition to a clean energy economy. Downstream, this means reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and justice for what we call frontline or disadvantaged communities that tend to face disproportionate impacts of climate change. But upstream, we've got communities adjacent to extraction sites and processing facilities and so forth that face a lot of challenges, some of which I just noted. Next slide, please. So there's really been a very little in the scholarship realm with regard to justice considerations for CORSIEM. Very few published papers. It hasn't really been on the map for folks in academia as much as it could be, and for a number of reasons. But there are some critical justice areas that we can glean out of a sort of literature review here. One, of course, would be rights. So these are critical justice area questions we might ask with regard to CORSIEM. One would be, are rights recognized for different impacted groups, for example, low income and indigenous communities? Another is taxation. So where is revenue from CORSIEM going? How is it distributed? We might also ask questions about job creation as well. So economic justice issues for local communities within the CORSIEM ecosystem. Environmental impact assessment. So are there mechanisms to compel adherence to national and local standards to encourage transparency and meaningful public and stakeholder participation? Waste management is a core justice area. How are externalities going to be managed? Who pays for them? Who's managing them? What regulations exist to ensure that that management is done correctly? And then, as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, cross-border actions. So our production process is ethical. For example, as I noted, in this critical mineral sector, there are a number of human rights violations that have been documented in places like China with regard to the production of some of these materials. Next slide, please. So what might justice look like with regard to CORSIEM if we're going to think about it in terms of distributive procedural recognition and restorative justice? On the one hand, distributive justice for CORSIEM might mean equitable revenue distribution, job creation, and the thoughtful consideration of the environmental externalities such as waste and facility siting. Procedural justice might look like legal processes being observed, transparent processes for community involvement, inclusivity, ensuring everyone more or less has a seat at the table and has a say in the process. Recognition justice would mean that rights are recognized specifically with regard to indigenous and low-income communities. And then restorative justice with regard to CORSIEM might mean the rectification of injustice by appropriate parties. That could be reclamation of land and waste management. A lot of overlap between these categories here. But there are additional opportunities as well with regard to prioritizing environmental justice in CORSIEM. One is we have the opportunity to build an ethical supply chain. We have the opportunity to compete with China and others producing these largely imported materials at this point in time, which means reducing dependence, bolstering our domestic supply, and backing up claims of as national commitment to social and environmental equity. So there's a lot of opportunity here to that comes with prioritizing environmental justice in CORSIEM. And then last slide, I think. So just a final slide here, and I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but it's a useful way of thinking about an environmental justice analysis process with regard to really engaging with communities meaningfully. And this means doing your research, reviewing background materials about local communities, identifying areas, analyzing census data, and identifying potential areas of problem and opportunity, and then engaging with communities, boots on the ground, going into communities, having town halls, interviewing stakeholders and so forth to identify pathways and possible problem and opportunity areas to implement CORSIEM. So just a useful sort of pathway or blueprint here for thinking about CORSIEM and environmental justice. So that marks the end of my presentation this morning, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. I do just want to take one moment here before we move on to our next panelists, and I would like to introduce our two principal investigators on the CORSIEM projects here in Wyoming. I meant to introduce them up at the top. I apologize about that, but I actually think this is a good time for Aaron Phillips and Davin Bagdonis to introduce themselves and say anything you want to say about the CORSIEM projects.
Sure. Thank you, Selena. I'll go ahead here and then pass it to Davin. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Selena, Christine, and Davin for planning this webinar, and to all of our panelists for some really important content today. So I think Selena did a great job introducing the CORSIEM projects at the beginning. Just to emphasize, these projects address all aspects of developing new opportunities around rare earth elements, critical minerals, and carbon ore. And, you know, an essential part of this equation is environmental and social justice. So I also really appreciate that Matt mentioned the complete supply chain here, because, you know, environmental and social justice needs to be considered along all parts of that supply chain. So with that, I just want to say welcome and thanks again, everyone, for your participation. So I'll pass it to Davin.
All right, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Selena, for moderating this. I think most everything has been said about the CORSIUM projects, and I look more forward to the remaining panelists and the questions that come out of this. So I did want to thank those panelists. Matt, your presentation was excellent. I look forward to the next ones. I had hoped to sneak out of being introduced, Selena, after we started, but I think we have a very well-rounded group of presenters here today. This is a topic on the CORSIUMs I've been least familiar with, but most excited to learn about. So I'll leave it at that. And again, thank you all for being present today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Davin and Erin. And we'll move on to our next panelist now, Savannah Rice. She's the Science, Technology, and Policy Fellow at the Department of Energy.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today and inviting me to speak. And thank you for the introductions. Matt did a great job of overviewing environmental justice. So I'm an ORISE Fellow at the DOE, and I'm going to give you guys the federal perspective on environmental justice, social justice, all of that. Next slide, please. So as you guys are probably going to memorize this definition today, at the DOE, we're using the EPA definition of environmental justice. So just to reiterate what the previous speakers have said, it's the fair treatment and equal involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So the things I want to emphasize from this is that environmental justice is going to be achieved when people get the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process. Environmental, energy, and climate justice, injustice persist all across the United States, and they're closely linked together along with social justice. Next slide, please. So at the federal level, our first step in tackling environmental injustice has been with the Executive Order 14008, the Justice 40 Initiative. So 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments related to clean energy, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and several more categories have to flow to disadvantaged communities, or DACs. So DACs are defined at the census tract level. There's 36 indicators identified by the DOE that are defined by vulnerabilities, environmental hazards, energy burden, and dependence on fossil energy. So the Division of Mineral Sustainability, which I'm in, which oversees some of these CORSIUM projects, falls under the Justice 40 Initiative. So in alignment with that executive order, we need to incorporate justice and equity into all of our work at the federal level and measure and track the benefits that we get from doing so. Next slide, please. So some of the priorities and metrics for measuring Justice 40 investments are listed out here. Some of the important ones related to the CORSIUM projects are decreasing the energy burden in disadvantaged communities and environmental exposure, which may relate to cleaning up legacy pollution. Increasing access to clean energy enterprise creation and the clean energy job pipeline. So creating jobs within the critical minerals and rare earth sector in disadvantaged communities, and increasing energy resiliency and democracy. Next slide, please. So with Wyoming and the energy transition, identified by NETL, is this map on the left here is ranking different areas within the United States that are most related to fossil energy in general. So you can see that the entire state of Wyoming is in that 1 to 25 ranking area of depending on the fossil energy industry for jobs. So as we move into an energy transition, you can expect that areas like Wyoming are going to be pretty hard hit if we're moving away from coal and fossil energy. So that's where CORSIUM comes in. Can we use those resources in a different way and keep jobs in the states for these people. So some of the things that you may want to think about, with environmental justice, social responsibility, and all of that in Wyoming with the energy transition is, what skills does your population have? What legacy pollution is there to be cleaned up? What do tribal nations in the state find most important? And what existing infrastructure do you have that can be repurposed in an environmentally friendly way and is close to where people are already living and working? And so these are all just kind of some of the high level questions that we've been thinking about at the DOE level. On to the next slide, please. So I presented this a couple of weeks ago at the larger CORSIEM webinar, but these are just some examples from the addendum to the funding opportunity announcement of how you might address the subtasks that were assigned to you related to environmental justice, community engagement, and workforce development. So some of the ideas that we have are, determining where the coal is coming from and the associated legacy environmental impacts of previous coal mining, and what's going to happen if we go in there and clean it up. What's the amount of coal waste that you're using and cleaning up versus the amount of useful products that we're forming? And then how planned technologies are going to remediate legacy environmental impacts. In the community engagement piece, so social justice here, how are we going to plan to ensure community and stakeholder input from the very beginning of your projects towards the end and incorporating their feedback? What workers are going to be recruited and what kind of training is going to be required for them? Or do those skills already exist and you can kind of just roll that over into this new workforce? And then, records of interactions with state and local government, tribes, unions, et cetera, and incorporating people's input in a meaningful way. And then finally, that workforce development piece, again, with social justice, is this process going to create new jobs in the area at a good wage and related to the energy transition? To what extent are those going to be located in communities that may be economically distressed with the sunsetting of, the coal industry as a power server? And then how many new jobs are going to be created in the area? So these are just some examples from the funding opportunity announcement of how the CORSIEM projects may go about addressing all of these problems from the DOE level. Next slide, please. I wanted to point out a few tools that have been developed at the federal level to address environmental justice, kind of to get us going. So this is the CEQ Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. It's an online tool. I can send out these slides later, but this just identifies where disadvantaged communities are across the United States based on those different metrics that I talked about previously. So this is a beta version. And if you go onto the website and use this tool, there's clear links for feedback that if you want to go in and give them feedback at how this tool can be improved, what other things may need to be incorporated to make it an effective tool to use, that would be great. So this is at the census tract level, which, as a few people brought up in the webinar a couple of weeks ago, especially in a state like Wyoming, that may not be the best way to identify injustices. And we've been talking about that at the DOE as well. So we're working on our own definition of disadvantaged communities, and it may have to change from state to state. As you can see, there's tons of little dots out east, but if you have these very large census tracts out in Wyoming, you may not accurately identify where the hardest hit communities are. So on to the next slide. Another way we can address this is the EPA's environmental justice screening tool, which was recently updated. So they're also taking feedback as well if you want to go in and give them some ideas of how they can improve it. But there are many different data sets. As you can see on the left, all of those tabs open up and you can explore everything that they've provided. And they use different, they use some finer data sets rather than census tracts. Some use census blocks and even finer data sets. So I just wanted to show how specific it can get with this wildfire hazard potential map. So you can see that this is much more detailed than those big census tracts used in the disadvantaged communities, map. So this is another really useful tool if you want to try to get down to finer details and really identify which areas of the state need the most help. And then on to the next one. So addressing environmental justice in your basin, I talked a little bit about what was on the funding opportunity. But these are just some more ideas from DOE. So we haven't put out many specific directives yet or official documentation, as everyone is still wrapping their heads around what it means, to put all of that out at the federal level. But some of the ideas that we have that are really important are sustained and meaningful engagement with communities and tribes. So early and often life cycle engagement is really key to making sure that the feedback from disadvantaged communities gets incorporated into the work that we do. And also that pairs with community outreach. So as you're all in academia, professional societies, we also want to look at K through 12, college and post-grad, different levels of the education system where these people are going to need to be trained to come up and get the jobs that are coming in the future in the critical minerals industry. Also local governments, tribes, and labor unions. And then another important way is metrics and data collection. So can we find quantifiable ways to show improvement in energy access, employment, environmental metrics, et cetera. Workforce development plans that are in line with the administration's goals of creating more of these good paying union jobs that are in the energy transition. And then also making sure that environmental and health considerations are put in place every step of the way so that we're not creating problems that we have to go back and solve later down the road. Then the next slide, please. And finally, this is just reminding of the specific requirements that the DOE gave in the addendum to the funding opportunity. As were mentioned before, these three subtasks of environmental justice considerations, economic revitalization and job creation, and then an environmental safety and health analysis. So that's it for me, and I'm looking forward to everyone's questions later.
Thank you so much, Savannah. And just as a reminder, you can be putting your questions in the Q&A at any time, and then we'll start to answer those after all of our panelists speak. Our next panelist is going to be Kip Coddington. He's a senior analyst here at University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, and he's going to be talking about legal and policy considerations. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And again, it's a pleasure to be here. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to cover 5 brief topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal underpinnings of social and environmental justice, which I will be collectively referring to as EJ. I'm going to summarize some of the current policies, the Justice 40 initiative, one slide on some tools, and again, the prior speakers have touched on some of this, so I'll be skimming over those. And then I do just want to give an example from Wyoming. Next slide, please. So I do think it is important that I think when people hear EJ, the assumption might be that this is a soft or squishy topic, and it maybe does not have legal rigor to it. I just want to remind everyone that actually it does have legal underpinnings to it, and those legal underpinnings really fall into 5 buckets. One is the due process clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which echoes the phrase we all know, no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That also appears in the 5th Amendment. The 5th Amendment applies to the federal government. The due process clause of the 14th Amendment brings those obligations down to the states as well. And very consistent with Matt's presentation, the Supreme Court, through cases going back for a century or more, has interpreted the rights under the due process clause to fall into 3 buckets. There's procedural due process, which again Matt talked about. There's also the individual rights in the Bill of Rights, and there's substantive due process. And again, there's lots of case law on all of this. The second legal underpinning of EJ is the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Under that, racial discrimination, as we all know, is constitutionally suspect. But the U.S. Supreme Court, again, in a series of decisions going back for decades, has interpreted the Equal Protection Clause to prohibit discrimination on other bases besides race. So this is not just about racial discrimination, although obviously that is a key part of it as well. Another legal basis for EJ is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. EJ issues must be adequately considered when there is a federal agency action that may involve environmental impacts on minority populations, low-income populations, and/or Indian tribes and indigenous peoples, and we see that with the EPA screening tool that Ms. Rice had previously discussed. The next legal bucket underpinning EJ is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program or activity that receives federal funds or other federal financial assistance. And then, of course, depending upon where you live, these rights may also find legal rooting in state constitution, statutes, or regulations. And of course, here in Wyoming, we are the equality state. And so we certainly take these issues very seriously under state law as well. Next slide, please. I just want to briefly go over the current Biden administration policies on this. And again, I'm not going to duplicate what the other speakers have said. The first is Executive Order 13985, and it directs federal agencies to assess and advance equity using federal resources, and it provides a definition of equity. And I'm not going to read that, but you can see that's quite broad, and again, these slides will be available, so you can read that at your leisure. Next slide, please. The second most significant executive order, and the one that is really on point, is Executive Order 14008, which actually has the root of these EJ requirements for the Biden administration, despite the fact that this executive order is titled and is targeting climate change. And this executive order did a lot of things. It gave a mandate to all federal agencies to incorporate EJ in their policies and financial decisions, including grant making. It created a White House EJ Interagency Council. It mandated that federal agencies designate an EJ officer. It created the White House EJ Advisory Council. And as the prior speaker noted, it directed CEQ to create this climate and economic justice screening tool, which is now available. And then it did create this initiative called the Justice 40 Initiative, which has the goal of ensuring, to the extent possible, and again, this is a goal, that federal investments might be made with a goal that 40% of the overall benefits flow to disadvantaged peoples. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read this slide. So this is the guts of the Justice 40 Initiative. It defined what a community is, and it's interesting. So a community can be in a geographic region, or it can be dispersed as long as they share common conditions. So it's interesting to understand what a community is. This Justice 40 Initiative, through the OMB guidance, also gave a broad definition of what it means to be disadvantaged. And again, these programs are targeting a disadvantaged community. And so I won't read that definition of disadvantage, but you can see, again, it's really quite broad. And again, under this Justice 40 Initiative, it applies to a wide variety of covered programs, including clean energy. And that would include a lot of the Department of Energy grants that we are currently managing here at the School of Energy Resources. And it applies to covered investments by the federal government, which again includes grants and other types of financial assistance, including loans, credit, guarantees, or direct spending. Next slide, please. And so I just want to note, and again, Savannah did a great job of covering this. There are a wide variety of tools that people can use to make your initial assessment of EJ considerations. And there are 4 of them. There are at least 4 of them at the federal level. There is this climate and economic justice screening tool, as previously noted. This primary purpose is it defines and maps disadvantaged communities for the purposes of informing how federal agencies should guide the benefits of certain programs. There also is a US EPA's EJ screening tool, which is, of course, is focused on environmental burdens. The Department of Energy has a energy justice dashboard that takes a snapshot of where recent federal investments have been, including grants and what that might mean for the communities that are associated with those grants. And then lastly, and I thought this was really most interesting for Wyoming, the Biden administration early on created the so-called IWG, which is the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Cities and Economic Revitalization. That IWG has recently published what it calls their priority energy areas. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is according to the Interagency Working Group, again, that's focused on coal and coal plant towns and the like, and coal areas that are undergoing economic stress related to what we all now see going on in the coal markets. So it ranks 25 high priority areas for federal investments. And those are broadly shown on the map to the left. And you'll see that Wyoming falls into priority regions as indicated by those green marks. One is the Northern Rocky Mountain region, and the other is the Four Corners area. And indeed, in the ranking of the top 25, Eastern Wyoming appears as number 8, and Western Wyoming appears as number 9. And so, again, as the prior speakers have noted, there's different ways to slice up these various EJ assessments, and those prior tools I think are quite fascinating. And I would, for the Wyoming audience, I would specifically like to draw people's attention to this recent work product by the Interagency Working Group. Next slide, please. I think I'm done, Selena. And that's it. So again, it's a privilege to be here today, and I'm looking forward to Q&A. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kip. And we are going to move on to our next panelist. We're going to have Bonnie Peterson. She is the Executive Director of the Associated Governments of Northwestern Colorado, and she's going to give some perspective on the communities in Southern Wyoming and Northern Colorado.
Well, good morning and thank you. I'm in a new location, so trying to operate on that. But at any rate, thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the concerns of the communities in Northwestern Colorado who are heavily impacted by coal across our region. Would you go to the next slide, please? So Northwest Colorado has 3 counties with significant coal operations, and we'll just kind of go through those counties. If you'll go to the next slide, we'll start with Rio Blanco County. Rio Blanco County had a 2020 population of 6,260. That's a decline of 5.4% since 2010. Rio Blanco County not only is home to the Desperado coal mine, they have also had 4 decades robust energy development engine driving their economy, largely with oil and gas. So they're seeing significant declines there. And the Desperado coal mine provides coal to a power plant across the border in Utah. Next slide, please. In the next county is Moffat County, and Moffat County's 2020 population was 13,181. That was a decline of 4.5% since 2010. Moffat County is home to the Trapper coal mine and the Kalawayo coal mine. Both of these mines provide coal exclusively to the coal-fired power plant known as Craig Station, located in the largest city there in Moffat County, which is Craig. There are 3 units to this coal-fired power plant. Unit 1 produces 427 megawatts of power. The closing date is established for retirement for Unit 1, and that will be the end of year 2025. Unit 2 is a 410 megawatt unit. Its estimated retirement date is end of year 2029. And Unit 3 is a 448 megawatt station. Estimated retirement date is end of year 2020. I'm sorry, 2029 as well. Next slide, please. And then Routt County is the larger of the 3 counties in Northwest Colorado that are coal reliant, coal dependent, coal producers. The 2020 population of Routt County is 25,929. That's an increase of 10.6% since 2010. Routt County is home to the Foydell Creek coal mine, which is also known as the 20-mile coal mine, and home to Hayden Station with 2 units, Unit 1 producing 220 megawatts, and Unit 2 producing 221 megawatts, both estimated retirement at end of year 2030. Routt County is larger, as you can tell through the population, than the other 2 counties, and more diverse from an economic standpoint. They are heavily reliant on tourism. They have a world-renowned ski area and do very well as far as that goes, but that also poses other problems that we'll talk about going forward. Next slide, please. So actually, this is a picture of Craig Station, and when you look at the land around Craig Station, it has been reclaimed. All of that was coal mine. It has been reclaimed, and the condition of the land is better than it was previously. It is great habitat for antelope in that region and other wildlife. But when we're talking about coal and the contribution of coal, both mining and power production in Northwest Colorado, the direct and indirect impact is 2,862 jobs. It generates 228 million in labor income and 621 million in regional GDP. For scale purposes, that's 21.7% of the 3-county regional GDP, 8.2% of the 3-county region jobs. Moffat County will see the greatest impact of this coal transition because they have the largest amount. For instance, Moffat County has 726 full-time equivalent employees directly employed in the coal industry. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm pulling these numbers from a study that Dr. Nathan Perry did at Colorado Mesa University in Grand Junction, Colorado, looking at what the impact would be should all coal be lost to Northwest Colorado across these 3 counties. Next slide, please. So ad valorem taxes are one of the sources of revenue for these counties across the northwest part of Colorado. And as you can see, these are the ad valorem taxes, pretty consistent across these counties. And you can see that the ad valorem taxes or property taxes in Moffat County total more than $12 million. Rio Blanco, 1.3 million. Now, this is coal only, and Routt County's 6 million. It's interesting to know ad valorem taxes also support school systems, as well as special districts and many government services. It's interesting to note that Craig Station makes up 37% of all the taxes for Moffat County, and the 2 coal mines account for about 7% of all those taxes. So combined tax revenue of 44.9% in Moffat County. So next slide, please. And let's go to the next one because it gets a little bit more into the individual county GDP percentages. So you can see in Moffat County, when the study looked at direct and indirect employment, in Moffat County, direct and indirect employment numbers for employment equaled about 1,400 jobs. Labor income, 109 million, regional GDP, 321 million, total output, $632 million, a percent of employment, nearly 20%, and regional GDP for Moffat County only 47%. That means when coal goes away in Moffat County, 47% of their GDP goes away. What would happen if that were Denver or New York or any other big city? It would be catastrophic. It will be catastrophic for Moffat County. Routt County's regional GDP with the loss of coal is slightly more than 11%, Rio Blanco 26%, even though coal is a smaller portion than other fossil fuel development there. Total effect across the 3 counties, regional GDP of 21.73%. So go to the next one, please. So these counties have suffered extraordinarily over the last several years. Already coal production was declining, and these counties count on severance tax and federal mineral lease dollars that come in from coal extraction, as well as oil and gas. When the 2008 economic recession hit, these counties were hit especially hard. And they were working diligently to try to diversify their economies and try to come back and build back from that 2008 recession when the announcement of the coal closures came about. Right after the announcement of the coal closures, is literally, we got the announcement in early 2020, and right after that in March, we were locked down for the pandemics. And these counties, particularly Rio Blanco and Moffat County, had very, very, very few illnesses or hospitalizations from the COVID-19. I think Moffat County had 6 for months and months and months, and Rio Blanco had 1, but their businesses were totally closed down. Some of the businesses decided they may not want to reopen because they were looking down the future at coal has sustained this area. Coal is the provider of really high-paying jobs. So maybe we don't want to reopen. So we've been very concerned about that. Next slide, please. So while coal is a major economic driver across these 3 counties, the other major drivers include tourism, agriculture, and outdoor recreation. So Routt County is very, very heavily tourism economy. They have a large number of second homeowners and people who want to be located near the ski area. And it is a beautiful area. They want to be in that beautiful area. But that really, while it's the most diversified economy in the region, and we will still see an 11% hit when we lose all the coal, the pandemic really impacted tourism, really impacted Routt County more heavily than the other counties, because hospitality is a major, major driver in that community. Across the 3 communities, agriculture is a major driver. And when we talk about agriculture, it's mostly ranching. The ranchers raise beef and they raise sheep. And it's very, very important to the community, the culture, the identity of those communities. However, agriculture is really, I guess, cyclical, and it is very susceptible to things like drought and things like policy and things that really keep agriculture from supporting a family. So many agriculture families have somebody working in the coal industry. They either work at the power plant or they work in a coal mine to help supplement the income for agriculture. Outdoor recreation across the Northwest has really manifested itself in camping and fishing and hunting. Hunting is huge in Northwest Colorado. The largest elk herd in the world, it resides in Northwest Colorado. Yeah, we will see policy pressures from a recently passed ballot initiative that will introduce wolves in Northwest Colorado. Already, without even having wolves introduced, they are migrating in, and we are seeing stock depredation and elk kills and even stock animal dog stock. 2 stock dogs have been killed. So we're very concerned about what that will do. So all of these pressures serve to disadvantage these communities in Northwest Colorado. Next slide, please. So to outline transition issues that these communities, and essentially every community across every state, are looking at, particularly when you're a rural area and you're not near a major population center and there aren't jobs available. The coal industry provides definitely in Moffat and Rio Blanco counties, coal and fossil fuel development provide the best jobs in the area. And what's available? What are the job availabilities after coal goes away? And what we are working on with the communities is trying to identify how do we replace those jobs. We're already seeing across 2 of the counties a loss of population. How do the communities maintain their identity? It's the Great Northwest. It's a definitely iconic Western communities. And how do we maintain that as we lose the industry that has supported it? How do we continue to provide supportive services for schools and access to medical care and higher education? Already the schools do not have the same programs that urban areas provide because for instance, 60% of Moffat County are federal lands. So you don't derive ad valorem taxes, no property taxes off federal lands. Yes, there's PILT, it's a pittance in comparison. And this is true across the Rocky Mountain West. So how do we continue to provide those supporting services? Access to broadband infrastructure and access to telecommunications redundancy are issues that we deal with on a daily basis. And access to funding is huge. We, in our communities, don't have the funding to even pay a grant writer to help us write grants to obtain some of this funding. Just to give you an idea, AG&C combined with an economic development district through Region 10 to write a grant for a number of projects to address coal communities through the Build Back Better Challenge grant that EDA received. We submitted, I believe it was 8 projects that would have served both regions, and we were not selected in the Build Back Better Challenge. My understanding is that coal communities in Colorado, Wyoming, and a number of the Western coal states did not receive any funding. So we pivoted on that. There were some ARPA funds similar that the state received. And so the state legislature pulled together an opportunity, a very limited opportunity, where a legislator could submit projects to this economic recovery and relief fund that had $800 million designated for it, $800 million. We pivoted about 6 of the projects that we had submitted to Build Back Better. One of our legislators submitted those for us. Not one penny came to Northwest Colorado, not one. Moffat County last year reduced their budget by 10% because they're seeing declining population, they're seeing declining revenues. And we missed that opportunity now, for the most part, to access the 4-to-1 leverage for dollars through ARPA funding. Now we're looking at other ideas of where do we go for grants and how do we come up with the dollar for dollar match. So those are serious transition issues. It's nice to see that there are some dollars that have been identified. How do we access them is the question that our communities are asking. Next slide, please. So that's a lot of doom and gloom, but there are opportunities and we have been looking for those opportunities. We are very pleased to be involved with the CORCM project through University of Wyoming because they are looking at coal innovation opportunities that we have been looking at for 2 years. We were successful a couple of years ago getting a grant to investigate the feasibility of coal innovation opportunities in the region. And we not only are doing this work for the 3 counties I'm talking about in Colorado, but for 3 counties in Utah. We got some matching funds from the Energy Impact funds in Colorado and from some from the legislature in Utah, and to match that. And our playbook should be published soon. The folks that we have working on this have looked at supply chains. You know, what are the critical supply chains that the federal government really wants to be addressed? And can we do that? And can we utilize coal as an innovation for that? For instance, carbon fiber from coal could make a huge difference. It would be nice to potentially see a power plant repurposed to maybe create carbon fiber from coal. We believe the rare earth elements out of coal is a huge opportunity, and we're pleased that University of Wyoming is looking at that opportunity. We're working with Colorado Northwestern Community College to establish an innovation center that hopefully we can work with University of Wyoming and the CORSIUM project with to look at and research what the coal in our basin can be used for. Hopefully we can get this done before the pressure is to totally close the mines and we cannot get them reopened. As far as repurposing power plants, we've had conversations with the owners and purveyors of the plants in Hayden and in Craig, and Xcel Energy is the lead in Hayden. They've talked with the community about a number of items, all the way from turning that property into a business park to other types of power opportunities and potentially molten salt storage there. Craig Station, we've had conversations about the possibility of green hydrogen. We asked early on about natural gas, utilizing the station for natural gas, but we were told natural gas would be necessary as a backup to renewables, but that would come from other states. We would not do that in Colorado. And we have begun talking with some folks about small modular nuclear reactors that would replace the jobs, would replace the income if we could repurpose that plant to the small nuclear reactors that are being developed. That would be helpful. There's a very robust power transmission infrastructure available there. And we hope that there's a way to develop power to utilize that transmission. There are some solar projects going in. 1,283 megawatts is the power plant. There are solar projects going in that are going to be about 200 megawatts. It will take up, last number I heard was about 1,100 acres, and we'll utilize some of that power transmission. It will create, according to the study that Dr. Perry did, 4 jobs. That will not replace the 2,000 jobs we envision losing. The entrepreneurial development we would like to see through the Innovation Center. We have seen when large employers have left Western Colorado, we have seen people who want to stay behind. They don't want to move away, and they have an idea for a business. In Northwest Colorado, we don't have any place for them to go and prove out that concept. We hope to establish an innovation center to help with that. Our community college in Northwest Colorado has a robust aviation program. We are losing pilots. We are losing service to our region because pilots are being taken from the regional carriers to the large carriers. And we've made connections with aerospace companies. There's a huge aerospace ecosystem in Eastern Colorado along the Front Range. And we're hoping to encourage them to look at Northwest Colorado and look at some programs that we have, like the Rural Jumpstart. Tri-States talked about potentially doing an energy research and development center at their plant. And we have been working to identify remote work opportunities to not only help underemployed people in the region, help students who might want to stay there, but also help displaced workers to have a bridge to potentially go to school, get retrained, these workers are skilled workers, and their skills can transition nicely into other opportunities if we can get the funding to do the training programs and help them be able to pay their bills while they're going to school and find the jobs to come in. So the next slide, please. So we're trying to develop some optimism across the region, and that's our biggest challenge at this point in time. We do hope that some of the things we're working on will come to fruition, and we are looking for anything that we can do to replace these robust jobs and maintain our culture and our community identities. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. We've got one more panelist for you today, Daniel Cardenas. He's the Chief Executive Officer for Knowledge River. Daniel, would you introduce yourself? And I think you're going to talk to us about the Indigenous perspective.
Hi, my name's Daniel Cardenas. I don't have any slides, so I apologize for that. So you're stuck with my face, but I am the CEO of Knowledge River, which is a STEM initiative in Indian country. Also, chairman and CEO of the National Tribal Energy Association, which represents the 4 largest tribes, energy producing tribes in the country: the Navajo Nation in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, Southern Ute tribe in southern Colorado, the Crow Nation in Montana, and the MHA Nation in North Dakota. And so each of those is a fossil fuel tribe. Navajos has a lot of different resources. Southern Ute is the largest natural gas tribe. MHA is the largest oil tribe, and Crow Nation is the largest coal tribe. By themselves, they'd be the largest coal owner outside the federal government by themselves. So that's me. I am glad that all the presenters talked about environmental justice, social justice, the legal definitions, EPA definition. And so we have a good grounding in that. And so in regards to Wyoming's CORSIEM projects, the Green River Basin and Wind River Basin and the Powder River Basin, obviously, if you know Wyoming, there are, within the state, there are 2 federally recognized tribes, Eastern Shoshone tribe and the Northern Arapaho tribe here where I live on the Wind River Reservation in the center of the state. Eastern Shoshone territory, basically ancestral territory outside the reservation, is basically from Yellowstone south to Evanston and Rock Springs over to Rawlins and up into the Wind River Basin where the reservation is located. The northern part of the state, the Powder River Basin, all the way to the foothills of the Black Hills, down into the Wind River Basin, is the Crow Nation. That's their ancestral territory, and Arapaho and Cheyenne. They're from Casper down through Cheyenne into Denver, the Front Range, all the way down to Pueblo, and then over into Kansas and Nebraska is their ancestral territory. And so pretty much the 3 main tribes that deal with Wyoming are Crow, Eastern Shoshone, and Northern Arapaho. And so I think that, like I said, obviously there's a good foundation on the law in terms of environmental justice. I would say this is that the tribes have probably of most states in the West, or any communities in the West, the tribes have the longest relationship with the federal government. and probably the most complex. And over the years, there hasn't been a lot of trust, as you can probably imagine, between both sides. But from the tribe's perspective, whenever, just from their perspective, just from how they interpret things and how they see things, is that whenever people start talking about the law, in our guts, what we start to think is, when people start talking about the law, whether it's the federal government, state government, local governments, private companies, we interpret that as, what's the minimum I need to do for my projects to move forward. And so traditionally, with the NEPA and the state, the SEPAs of various states, project developers and state and federal governments basically have used the process, which tribes are included. Obviously, they're included, but because most tribes don't have resources, financial resources, to participate fully, even though the law says they need to be full participants, they don't have the resources to. And so, that's always been a problem. So hopefully this current administration and some of the laws that have been passed with the infrastructure bill and some of the whatever's going to happen in the future, hopefully some of that will be addressed, because tribes as governments don't have the tax bases that the counties and the states and other municipalities have. And so they're fully dependent on funds from the feds. If they don't have gaming, or if they don't have resources, then they're sort of they're just in a tough spot, and most likely don't participate except at the minimum levels. And so whenever we talk about the law, that they sort of shy away. We have plenty of Native attorneys now who understand the law, and I'm not an expert in the environmental law, but I would just, as we move forward in this conversation around the core CM, around Wyoming, and as these projects, as these planning moves forward, I think we just keep that in mind, that I'm glad that there's a focus on tribes, because a lot of times, and I always use this, I always say this, but tribes have always, they're always the last invited to the dinner and the first asked to leave. And so around fossil fuels, I'd mentioned I represent 4 of the largest fossil fuel generating tribes. Just when things were going good relative for those tribes, especially for MHA in North Dakota and the Bakken, they're right in the middle of the sweet spot of the Bakken. They, by themselves, depending on the year, they can produce 20 to 25% of all the Bakken production just on their reservation. And also with the Crow and their resources, these tribes, the Navajo Nation just recently, I think a couple years ago, purchased the Cloud Peak Energy out of bankruptcy. So they're the 3rd largest coal producer in the country. And so the tribes haven't gone away from fossil fuels. They actually have doubled down on their keeping into that industry. And so from their perspective, when we talk about energy transition and we talk about clean energy, they're just like I mentioned, the Navajo have a tremendous amount of solar and wind opportunities, geothermal, biomass, hydro, all the renewables, including uranium, oil, gas, helium. So they have and coal. They have almost everything you can imagine. But from their perspective, they weren't part of the conversation when it was decided that we were going to transition out of fossil fuels to something else, to something cleaner. And so basically they were just, forced to agree. And what they prefer is that if they choose to continue into fossil fuels, especially coal, we look at a basket of opportunities versus picking winners and losers, picking clean over fossil fuel. They'd prefer to be able to do a bit of everything if they can. Using the Crow as an example, they have opportunities in hydro, they have wind, they could do solar, geothermal, biomass as well as coal. And so they of the 4 tribes, the Crow are the most coal impacted because they've chosen to, on their reservation, continue production. And so in this whole conversation, just sort of my advice and sort of my 2 cents when it comes to involving the tribes is that, and I always say this, is that every single inch of the U.S. is Indian country. It's some tribe's ancestral territory, whether it's reservation land or not. And so most tribal people, they will, as we saw with the Dakota Access Pipeline and the XL pipelines and some of the other projects that that didn't come to fruition, a lot of tribal people even believe that off-reservation lands are tribal lands, whether they're treaty lands, whether they were tribal lands before reservation lands or not now. They still have this sort of tie to the land. And so although the environmental justice, social justice, the NEPA and the different laws behind it mandate certain things, the tribal people still believe that even if we don't control the land, or even if we don't own the land, that it still belongs to us, separate than the cultural resources that may exist, or graves that may exist, or any of the other attributes that are there. So really, I'm glad that we're part of the conversation, because I think as we move forward, what we really want to sort of relay to the non-native community is that tribes aren't going anywhere. They're sort of forever partners. I always like to use that term, is that tribes can be really good partners for the communities that are impacted as well. And so this whole process has been pretty fast, and so there hasn't been a lot of time to talk and get to know each other. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to create these relationships and these friendships with tribes, but they want to, and so they want to be part of the process. They want to be part of the solution. One of the things that, and I'll leave with this, one of the things that is really is becoming a thing in Indian country is beyond the equity and the things that we have been talked about earlier in regards to environmental justice, is that tribes nowadays, they want to be partners, not just treated like partners when it comes to the law. They actually want to be business partners and financial and equity partners in projects. And so I think the opportunities moving forward in Wyoming around the Green River and around Powder River Basin and Wind River Basins are bringing the tribes that want to participate in as partners, business partners. They may not have the development capital on hand, but through the feds and through the mechanisms in the infrastructure bill and other legislation in the past, tribes do have mechanisms to raise capital, whether it's guaranteed loans or whether, and there are financial investors who want to partner and provide the capital for tribal projects. And so just keeping that in mind, I think that tribes will be your biggest advocate. So if there are potential developers listening today, or that will be part of the process in the future, keep that in mind, that tribes want to be partners. They don't just want to be a checkbox that you just check to get your permit, or to get your to approve your EIS and those kind of things. They actually want to be at the table. They want to be part of the decision-making process. And so that was the unfortunate thing, that when we started this process of this energy transition, tribes weren't part of they weren't asked their opinions, and they weren't given sort of a voice in that process. And so, but we're here, we're at where we're at. And so I would just say that I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. And hopefully what I've said today makes sense. But to me, it's just the start of a conversation around not just the legal terms of EJ, but what actually the communities, how they actually interpret that and what that means to them. And so anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to all of our panelists today. We're going to move into the Q&A session now. So if I could get all of our panelists to turn your videos on. And we do have some questions already submitted in the chat, and please feel free to submit more questions. We'll start with one for Savannah. How is the 40% of the Justice 40 measured? Is DOE using the same framework for doing that as other US agencies? Can the credit of one type of benefit be used to offset another?
So the DOE's framework is not necessarily the exact same as other agencies. The White House directed each agency to come up with their own methodology. And we haven't released a specific official methodology yet, but the way that the 40% is basically calculated is the amount of a certain covered investment. So, that can be anything from grants to direct payments to communities, to procurement benefits, to staffing costs. 40% of those investments that we make at the federal level has to go to DACs. So that can be the number of jobs created in disadvantaged communities divided by the total number of jobs created as a whole by a certain program, or the loan amounts awarded for certain funding opportunities going to DACs versus, or divided by the loan amounts, the total loan amounts awarded. So that's the kind of basic way that it's divvied up right now. And the Justice 40 team is working on more official guidance and things going forward.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. How do we get tribal nations to be partners in these projects?
Do you mean, I'm assuming you mean the projects, the actual core CM projects, the rare earth mineral projects? Is that's what I'm assuming is the question.
I'm assuming that's the question as well. Yes.
So, again, it's just that's there's a little bit of a nuance to that. Obviously, if you're not already have a relationship or are friends with a tribe, it takes some time to get to know them and to get introduced to them, and just like any kind of relationship, it does take a little bit of time. I mean, probably a lot more than what a normal business relationship would be between two companies, or but really that's the start, and like I said, tribes don't have a lot of resources to be able to sort of take the initiative, and so a lot of times they're going to be playing catch up. But I would just suggest to the private sector, to any chance that they get, to reach out to tribes in the area that these projects may or may not happen. That's what I would do. Like I said, I can help in that. If they want to contact me, I can help make introductions and start that process.
Great, thank you. We've got one for Kip here. Could you talk about how water rights are going to play into this?
So yes, so that's a great question. So I would think, and here I'm giving a hypothetical answer, but as a lawyer, my sense is that the EJ considerations on the legal side tend to come up either in terms of a challenge to a permit or a siting decision. Someone wants to put a new emission control on a power plant, or someone wants to site a refinery, and then a plaintiff's lawyer would sue, challenging that siting decision or that permitting decision on various grounds. And hypothetically, one of those grounds could be access to water, that the siting of a certain industrial facility might require water consumption that might, it would be argued, could threaten local water supplies in terms of quality or amounts, and water rights could certainly come into that. So certainly fair and equitable access to adequate and clean supplies of drinking water is a key part of the EJ consideration. So I would certainly think that water rights would be playing into a wide variety of these cases.
Thank you, Kip. Let's see, I've got one for Bonnie here. What are housing property prices like in the Colorado areas you discussed? Are there opportunities or challenges for attracting or retaining people on the basis of those prices?
Well, yes, thank you for that question. So it is quite interesting. Routt County housing prices, I think I mentioned, are very, very high. And people who work in the tourism industry there cannot really afford housing around the Steamboat Springs area. So they have to look at the greater part of the county. Even some of those prices are getting even higher in the more rural parts of the county. So there's quite a number of employees that actually live in Moffat County, which is less expensive. Having said that, with the pandemic, many people have decided that they want to live in a more rural area. So the housing stock has been taken up by people moving to rural areas. So pricing is more favorable in Rio Blanco and Moffat County, but the housing stock is short. So we definitely need to improve that situation and address the housing issues. However, if we find ourselves in a situation that we have 700 direct jobs and those people leave the community, and potentially the indirect jobs leave the community, that may solve the housing problem, but that's not a problem we want to have.
Thank you, Bonnie. Let's see, a question here. What if a federal project cannot provide 40% of investment funding to a project for EJ concerns as required?
So that's currently being worked on right now. A lot of the direct investments currently are not 40% to disadvantaged communities, and a lot of program benefits can't yet be quantified. A lot of it's pretty subjective still. So that's evolving right now.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I've got another one for Daniel here. Can you share some success stories from the National Tribal Energy Association? What have been the ingredients for success in areas that reaped benefits from mining and fossil fuels? Are there other areas that might have had success but did not due to a lack of planning? Also, as an aside, how much control do tribes have over remediation where they have federally recognized jurisdiction?
I would start with the last part first. I think the examples, there's a couple examples. One would be, and I haven't visited the site since because of the COVID, but as we know, on the Navajo Nation, the power plant, Navajo generating station that closed down a couple years ago during the last administration, they immediately started remediation, removing the plant and starting remediation. And because that was on lands that the tribe owned, even though it was in the middle of the reservation, they controlled the lands. There have been other situations where, for instance, here where I live, just down the street, just down the road, probably a half a mile, there's an old site that used to be a uranium processing plant, but it happened to be it's in the middle of the reservation, but it was on private lands that were owned by non-natives. And so the remediation of that was a little more trickier. It involved the state and the feds, and the tribes were involved, but they weren't sort of the leads. The tribe was involved, but the state and the feds were sort of the leads on that. And so it's a jurisdictional issue, and it is about even on reservations. But some of those things are through the Supreme Court are changing. If just recently we've had a case in Oklahoma that is resolving some issues around the reservations in that state. And there have been other court cases in regards to some treaty rights. So those are moving forward and hopefully being resolved. But so on the first part of the question, those 4 tribes that we represent, obviously each of them has been successful in their own way. The 2 most successful tribes are the Southern Ute. They're probably one of the most wealthy tribes in the country, just based on natural resources and their investments. They're a small tribe and have assets. I don't know what their assets are, but they're in the billions of dollars. And I think they're around 1,500 people. But in the MHA Nation, which again is about a third of the Bakken, they have a lot of revenue, a lot of income. They haven't really invested it yet, but they do have a significant amount of money, depending on where the price of oil is. So those have been some success stories. But some of the detriments, or some of the roadblocks, I guess, to success has been for the other tribes has been this lack of capital, lack of development capital to do projects, and then and so that's really been the driving force, as well as the lack of project development experience. Most of the tribes don't have that experience to be able to put a project, develop it through feasibility engineering and all that, and finance and stick with it, because the tribes are governments and politics control, just like all our other governments. Every so many years they have elections, and administrations can change, and so when that happens right in the middle of a project, those tend to go away, which is the unfortunate thing. But in Indian country, we're trying to resolve that by creating other mechanisms, other organizations, other institutions within our communities that can get past the politics. But hopefully I answered the question.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, another one here for Kip. Do you see adjustments to taxes being necessary as industries evolve? For example, how severance tax is calculated given the volumes will change. Do tax policies vary substantially across the Montana, Colorado, Wyoming?
Oh, so that's a great question. And I suppose the honest answer is that I'm not certain I'm equipped to answer that. So I'm not a tax attorney, and I'm not a tax specialist. I do know here in Wyoming, we don't have a personal income tax. We don't have a corporate income tax. So I think just at that, I'm quite certain that the taxation policies in those 3 states are different at a fundamental level. And the issue of severance tax, I mean, we're certainly seeing that to a great extent in Wyoming, at least with respect to coal revenue. So the bulk of the coal in Wyoming is mined from federal surface. Those are federal leases, a lot of them in Campbell County, in the Powder River Basin. And of course, the Powder River Basin extends into the southeast portion of Montana. So for a federal lease, the government is collecting those taxes and then pays 50% of them, 50% of those taxes back to a state like Wyoming. So as coal mining declines, I would anticipate that that severance tax revenue is gonna continue to decline. And I think we experienced that here in Wyoming in recent years. And so I think states like Wyoming have been having a discussion of tax policy for a long time. Where is revenue going to come from as historic sources are impaired? So yes, that tax issue is one of great importance.
Thank you, Kip. I'm gonna move to some of our pre-submitted questions, but please feel free to keep submitting questions in that Q&A as you have them. So we've got a question here. What additional justice concerns emerge with the recent push to increase domestic production of rare earth and critical minerals? Matt, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. So just a few, I think I mentioned some of them already, and some of this has been covered a little bit, but obviously there's potential geopolitical tensions and competition with, where most of these materials come from to begin with. Questions a lot that have come up in our conversation today. Will it benefit workers? Will it benefit communities? So just to some degree, I think we covered that. And then, in terms of our environmental labor regulations that we have existing, adequate or more stringent than those abroad. So how do we ensure that injustices aren't reproduced at home? And I think, there are plenty of examples of injustice regarding mining and extraction already in the United States. And so just folding in CORSIEM considerations with existing injustice issues here, I think is going to be a challenge. And, it remains to be seen what that looks like. But I think, our existing regulations and enforcement apparatuses, up to the task. So those would be ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you, Matt. I've got a question here for the leads of the CORSIEM projects. How are the leaders of the CORSIEM projects gathering information from community members and stakeholders about social and environmental justice issues? And what input would be most useful to gather from community members?
Sure, thanks, Selena. I'll start, and then Davin, if you want to follow up. So from the perspective of the Powder River Basin CORSIEM project, we're working with community colleges, we're working with economic development groups and local government groups within the Powder River Basin. That being said, we're always looking for new stakeholders because from my perspective, the community members are really going to have the most insight into what's needed, what are the most pressing issues in their communities. And, hearing from Bonnie and Daniel today really, that's just invaluable input for these CORSIEM projects. But I think many of these communities have gone through transitions in the past. They're currently going through transitions. And it would be the input that I think is really valuable is to know what's worked in the past, what has not worked in the past, what is the most pressing issue in your community right now. Currently, like I said, we're working with community colleges and academic institutions. But in terms of workforce development, one thing that I would still like to develop for the Powder River Basin CORSIEM project is some more work around K through 12 education and getting some insight from community members within the Powder River Basin on how to move that forward, how that plays into workforce development. So that's kind of the perspective from the Powder River Basin. And Davin, I'll let you address the Green River Basin.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I think there's a lot of parallels between the two projects, the PRB and the Greater Green River Basin core CMs, in terms of us casting a wide net across these communities. I think you see that reach for information, some of the definitions we seek from different levels in the communities all the way up to the federal government. In the way we've set up the panel for this discussion today, we want that top-down information from the DOE, from the federal government. What do those policies describe to us? And then talking with folks like Daniel, with Matt, with Bonnie, folks on the ground in the communities, for that perspective from the bottom up, from those communities looking up at how these policies are being described. So in that effort, like Aaron described, we're working with community colleges. They're partners on the Green River Basin project. I've reached out to Bonnie and the AGNC, similar organizations around Rock Springs. We have an ever-growing stakeholder list. I think it's important to remember that stakeholder list is everyone from the coal miners to the metallurgists, those folks downstream in the supply chain we expect to develop from this, to your everyday folks living in these communities. Craig, Colorado, Rock Springs, Wyoming. We have local newspapers reporting on core CM locally, and just that I'd emphasize that wide net we've cast. So I don't know if that fully answers. I think a lot of this information, the dissemination of it, is still incoming. We're still trying to understand everything we need to include. So it's an active discussion, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Davin, and thank you, Aaron. And there's another question here kind of related to what Davin was just saying about how do we kind of like balance the community level perspective and the federal level perspective? How can these two perspectives like meet in the middle and make sure that they're finding common ground and communicating? Do any of our panelists have any thoughts about that?
I might have a little to say on that, having, worked a little bit to bridge the gap between community perspectives and state level perspectives, is, going back to what Davin just said about expanding what we consider who we consider stakeholders. And some of the work that I've done in terms of energy transition research and engagement in Wyoming is incorporating broader groups of stakeholders. I've worked with youth a bit, and asking youth to express their visions for the future of Wyoming in the year 2030, using different multimedia projects. And the goal of that project wasn't just to have fun, but to sort of publish and disseminate those perspectives to state leaders. And while those youth concerns seem maybe a bit outside of the scope of the conversation we're having today, I think that really matters in terms of having conversations and with stakeholders, expanding who we consider stakeholders, building social license in various ways for certain projects, and sort of bridging the types of conversations we have today with what Davin said, the sort of everyday Wyomingites or Coloradans, right? And so I think that more outreach and engagement and in a variety of different formats, I think, is going to be key.
Great.
Yeah, and from the federal level with this, I think things like this are great for us from the DOE to get involved. And I think that, with our working groups that we're forming for Core CM and everything like that, I think, seeing what your guys' experiences are engaging with your communities and what they communicate to you, bringing it back to the DOE level as we move forward and fund more projects in the future and continue developing our guidance around this. I think that I would love to stay involved this way. And I think others in the DOE would echo the same, that keeping that engagement and not having, the DOE over here and just giving guidance and not even listening. I think that communication is super important.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. I have another one here that I think maybe you can speak to, Savannah. Do the teams have to use DOE and EPA justice tools, or can teams determine their own best ways to analyze their communities?
Yeah, so those are just there for guidance and any kind of resource that you guys may want, but the best way really to analyze your own communities is really important, especially in the case of Wyoming, if we're kind of dragging our feet on using the census tracts and things like that, take it in your own hands to find the best ways to analyze your communities and help them out.
Thank you. Okay, we do have another question here in the Q&A, and this one is for Kip. Which state is currently most advantaged in terms of the current legal framework for access to the upstream waters needed for economic activity? Do you expect that legal landscape to shift substantially as climate and other pressures increase demand and conflict between areas trying to access? Are there any negotiations or settlements in the works that might change this picture?
So clearly water rights between the states, between and among the states, is a key issue, number one. And number two, with the ongoing drought in the West, this is a topic of great concern, as everybody knows. Certainly Wyoming is a headwater state for Colorado and states to the southwest. I'm not privy to the nature of those interstate negotiations, and so I can't comment on those. But I would just imagine that will be a topic of ongoing concern, and that's really all I know about that.
Thank you, Kip. Another one that I'll open up to the whole group to discuss, and it's about how we define the future impacts of industries that aren't yet developed and are only now being planned for. So CORSIEM can bring a diversity of technologies and planning, but the outcomes can really only be predicted right now. So how do we predict the impacts as well as plan for considering the environmental justice concerns? Do any of our panelists have thoughts about that?
I'll say that obviously the CORSIEM, these initial funding, and I'm assuming as we move forward with later phases, that basically the feds and the states and our local communities are trying to figure out which coal resources have the best rare earths, whether it's from the coal that's being burned from the leftover from the ash, or from the coal itself. I mean, obviously the ash is more concentrated, but each basin has different qualities. And so I think once we figure out which basin has the best qualities for whatever minerals we're looking for, I think then that that answer can probably be better answered, because it could be in a basin that, like the Wind River Basin, which is probably, as we know, is the least studied of all the basins, the least amount of production in the past, and really there's nothing going on right now. And so maybe what if that's the basin with the best opportunity? So there's really no impacts right now, and then there will be impacts in the future potentially. And so maybe we move from a basin like the Powder River Basin, where maybe, I'm assuming there are better resources there, but who knows? Like I said, once that question is answered, once we get those baselines or that information about where the minerals are, and which ones we're actually looking for, which ones we want, then we could probably go down that road about what the impacts will be.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, Bonnie, go ahead.
Thank you. So I think one of the things that is important to do is to look at the other studies that have been done related to coal. DOE has funded a number of studies. University of Utah, this is where I got on the carbon fiber idea, did a study funded through the EDA looking at utilizing coal for carbon fiber. There are tremendous opportunities for that if indeed we can figure out how to make it price effective. And I'd like to know more about that. I think we need to be spending some resources on how do we bring that proof of concept forward and how do we make that happen. We use carbon fiber in literally every aspect of our daily lives, medical, airlines, transportation, recreation. We use it everywhere. There are other opportunities. Also, I understand DOE funded some research into turning coal into carbon pellets that can be used to develop melt-blown fabric. Melt-blown fabric is used for personal protective equipment, which our strategic supplies are desperately low on after this pandemic, and they weren't well stocked to begin with. Well, let's bring that home. Let's bring that supply chain home so that if we have another issue like we've suffered over the last 2 years, we don't have to rely on China to do that. Rare earth elements, of course, is a clear issue around that. And then what's one of the major components in solar panels? It's coal. So are we going to close all of our coal mines and not be able to produce solar panels domestically? I don't like the idea of trading one energy reliance from countries that don't like us very much to energy reliance on another country that doesn't like us very much. I think we need to look at all these studies and we need to figure out how we bring those supply chains here. And I think we need to target those coal communities that are in harm's way. That includes our tribes, it includes our small communities, our rural communities. We need to target them and bring that investment there. One of the things I've been saying to anybody who will listen to me, maybe we should look at our coal communities and designate them as an opportunity zone so that we can get some private investment in those communities. So I think there are some opportunities. I think we've already got a lot of work done, but our communities don't have the ability, they don't have the funding, the resources to do these proof of concepts. The work's already been done. How do we now prove the concept and entice that manufacturing then to go to those communities? So that's my thought.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, if we're trying to sort of game out scenarios for the future, I think interdisciplinarity in terms of the way we design studies and engage with communities is going to be really important as well. Learning from, we're learning from the past, learning from other, issues in other sectors. So, if we're going to look at what's going on with the coal industry right now, what's going on with the energy transition right now, current challenges with that, I think we can extrapolate those lessons as we move forward and also think about multiple ways of engaging with communities beyond, economic assessments, talking about economic diversification a lot. I think there's a lot of opportunities to engage with communities around core values. It's something we do at SVR all the time and talking about community values and statewide across Wyoming. And I think doing that is going to be really important for the justice component as well. And not just talking about economic development, but talking about other forms of justice as well. And so I think that interdisciplinary approach is going to be really important. I know that's more of an academic perspective, but I still think it's going to be really important for justice going forward.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left here. Do any of our panelists have any last minute thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap up here?
So this is Kip. I would just like to thank my fellow panelists, and in particular, I'd like to thank Aaron and Davin, the respective co-PIs, the PIs on these two CORSIEM grants, and I think this part of it is absolutely key. It goes to social license, and so I just wanted to thank the leadership of the grant.
Yeah, I would like to thank all of our panelists today as well as all the participants that showed up and asked great questions. I want to thank Christine Reed for helping to organize all this and make sure all the technology ran smoothly. So thank you to everyone that helped make this work. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted online along with the slides. So that will be available as well. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.